This isn't quite how we expected to be running our 2020 annual conference when we were discussing it last year at our conference at the Barbican. So I'm delighted to see so many of you able to join us today virtually. Following the Prime Minister's 10-point plan published just yesterday evening, it seems fitting that we are coming together today to discuss how we can drive green investment, support heat decarbonisation, and support and help make homes and buildings greener and warmer. We have a fantastic speaker lineup today, but before I hand over to them, I just wanted to cover off some quick housekeeping. So first of all, if you could mute during the presentations, that ensures that everyone can hear our speakers clearly. If you could turn off your cameras to help improve the quality for everybody participating. If you do have questions, and we'll be taking questions throughout the session today, if you could type those into the chat function or raise your hand during one of the speaking sessions, we'll raise those questions with our speakers during the allocated Q&A sessions. And as you can see on screen, we've got quite a packed agenda today. We'll be hearing from BEIS, from the Triple Point Heat Networks team, the Green Finance Institute, the ADE, the Department for International Trade, and Ancala. So I will hand over to our first speaker. John, over to you.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks for that great introduction, and I'm glad you've covered off the PM's 10-point plan because I think that really sets the scene and hopefully avoids me getting too many questions on it. Other than to say, it's a fantastic commitment to see this building of an investment in the green economy and the green recovery. So I guess I'm here to really set the scene, set the context for the lineup of speakers later in the day, and just kind of talk through how we see heat networks playing such a crucial role. So for us, it really started with net zero, and our commitment by 2050 to get to net zero, which we committed to in June last year as a legally binding target. Excuse me, as a legally binding target. You'll be familiar that we've made great inroads into decarbonisation of the power sector. The levels of investment that we've seen in onshore and offshore wind, in solar PV, in new CCGTs, many things that have really put us ahead of the curve. But it's widely recognised that decarbonisation of heat is the next big challenge alongside transportation and industry, in fact. So when we talk about decarbonisation of heat, there are a number of different pathways if we're talking about heat in buildings. So those pathways are typically thought of as low carbon gas, so hydrogen or green gas injected into the grid, or an electrification pathway, so big heat pumps, electric heaters, that kind of thing, and a kind of hybrid in between the two. Actually, heat networks play a really interesting role in any of those pathways because they can operate in both those environments and, in fact, improve the effectiveness of both those pathways. So, our position has been consistently for actually the last 8 years, and certainly in terms of our long-term forecasting into the future, that heat networks are going to play a really, really vital role. So if we can just move on to the next slide, please. So what's the role? Well, right now we've got heat networks at around 2% of heat delivered. It's been 2% for a while, and we've actually installed an awful lot of stuff. So I think that figure is soon to round up to 3. But it's still pretty low when we think about actually the scale of the opportunity being somewhere like 18% of heat delivered by 2050. So thinking about that in terms of terawatt hours, that's probably something like 90 to 100 terawatt hours of heat delivered through heat networks, which is a sizable chunk, of growth that's required. So these numbers are driven out of the Committee on Climate Change and what they consider to be the most cost-effective pathway to meeting our carbon targets. So why do we like heat networks? Well, actually, heat networks don't save carbon on their own, but what they do enable is us to unlock some of the really exciting large-scale, low-carbon sources of heat that's available right the way across the country. Whether that's heat coming from energy from waste plants, rivers, mine workings, along with a whole host of other sources. Actually, they're able to unlock those sources of heat that you probably wouldn't do on just a building level scale. But not only that, they add benefit to the wider energy system. So, if you think about electrification scenario, you might have hundreds of heat pumps within buildings, or a handful of very large heat pumps on a network. And actually, because of the greater efficiencies, the improved performance, the ability to trade on the system, to store energy, and to respond to the wider energy system, what you're doing is enabling a much more effective use of energy in meeting that demand. So we really like them from that perspective as well. In terms of what we need to get us out to 2050, actually, it's a huge investment opportunity. This is why we're here today, and this is why we've continued to have this series of investor conferences since I think the first one was 2015. So this is part of an ongoing conversation that was started some time ago. We think kind of working backwards from the sort of scale of the opportunity, the investment potential is somewhere between 20 and 30 billion. And the reason that's really important for us to be here today is that actually we're not going to be able to fund all of that through the mechanisms that we're using right now primarily, which is public sector using Public Works Loan Board borrowing. It's cheap, but it's not limitless, or using the balance sheet strength of very large corporates in the kind of ESCO market. So it's going to be really important, just like we've seen in wind and other sectors, to unlock large-scale pools of third-party capital, and that's primarily the reason that we have these conversations. Have the next slide, please, Sam. Thank you. So we recognise that this market won't just grow on its own. That actually it requires consistent government support. So I was just going to give a kind of whistle-stop tour of the kind of key tenets of that support before going into some of the more specific stuff. So we've been government's been supporting heat networks in the market since 2013, where we formed the Heat Networks Delivery Unit in order to develop projects and get them into a position where they're investable propositions, and have done a good job driving through a pipeline in excess of 300 projects across England and Wales, and we've put £25 million into the market in order to develop that pipeline. That pipeline was actually one of the key reasons that we were able to launch the Heat Network Investment Project back in 2017, which is our £320 million capital project, and we'll hear lots more from Ken about that next. Essentially, that addresses one of the common issues with heat networks, which is they're good performers, they return well, but they're analogous to other types of long-term infrastructure, returning in the kind of mid-single digits. So HNIP was designed to give that a bump, recognising that we've made huge strides in getting to this self-sustaining market, but we're not quite there yet. We announced in March of this year, coming off the back of the March budget, our Green Heat Network Fund, which is a further 3-year capital support programme from 2022 to 2025. And that actually does things very similar to HNIP, but importantly tries to accelerate that transition to the next generation of low and zero carbon technologies that we're going to need in order for heat networks to play that crucial role in net zero. I guess sort of underpinning that, or going over the top of it, is our look at proportionate regulation in the 2020s. So there's a small amount of regulation in the sector at the moment, but it doesn't look and feel like other regulated sectors that you might be familiar with. So we committed to introducing a long-term market framework by 2022 to enhance consumer protections, to kind of increase investability through additional rights and powers, and to ensure decarbonisation of networks through the 2020s and 2030s. And finally, and this is very, very recent, we've announced that we'll be consulting on heat network zoning in spring next year, which looks to, I guess, knit together a coherent narrative for heat networks across the 2020s. So thinking about it coming in 2025 and starting to address the risk side of the risk return equation, insofar as it's looking to address primarily connection risk. Next slide, thank you. So way back when, it may have been 2 or 3 investor conferences ago, an old colleague, which was very much like this, you said we did, and I just thought I'd talk through some of the kind of common things that we've heard over the years from the investor community, and the extent to which those have been heard, acknowledged and addressed. So we were told that there weren't enough projects. So we've put 25 million into the development of these projects and created a pipeline in excess of 2 billion. And we publish that on a quarterly basis. So we've got that flow of information and data into the market, so that people can start thinking about how to allocate their resources. We're told they all look different. So we've driven standardisation throughout the development, commercialisation, contractual and construction stages. And that's really the bedrock of of what we do, to try and get them all to look as similar as possible. There were concerns that performance might not be what was needed. So we introduced an initial code of practice through CIBSE. We've developed a range of performance sort of indicators. We've spent close to £500,000 on a heat network optimisation project, looking at those ways to improve networks and enhance those returns that you might want to see. And we've got a commitment to introduce technical standards in our market framework regs when they come into force in 2022. We're told the deal size was too small. Well, yeah, absolutely. What we've seen is actually an increase in the kind of size of individual projects, roughly from about 12 million to 20 million, as the Heat Network Investment Project has, I think, dragged out the appetite and the ambition of project developers. But also we've seen an increased ability, because of this standardisation, we've seen an enhanced ability to aggregate across assets in a kind of non-geographical way. We're told the returns weren't high enough. We've got 320 million of HNIP going into the sector. We've got another 270 million going in through the Green Heat Network Fund. And actually we've identified further revenue enhancements in terms of the revenue stack that we might be able to in the future as we see this sort of transforming energy system. We're told the cost of due diligence was too high for the deal size. Again, trying to get projects to look the same, but actually some really tangible things. So our delivery partner through HNIP produced a fantastic sort of standard contract set, the sales operation and maintenance set, SOMS, and these are all freely available. And that was looking at replicating much of the learning from PFI and PPP experiences. And of course, we wanted, when projects were being presented to the investor community, that they were being done in a way that was appropriate for that community, and so working closely with with you all to come up with a standardised due diligence set, so there was everyone knew what they were aiming for and try and reduce that cost. We're told there's lack of regulation, mentioned regulation by 2022, and there's too much connection risk, and we hope to start addressing that next year through the consultation for zoning. I guess the overarching question was has always been about where's the long-term certainty, and I hope in this whistle-stop tour of the fact that we've got net zero embedded as a legal requirement, and we've got heat networks as a critical part of meeting that requirement, delivering up to 20% of heat by 2050. The fact that we've put in almost £500 million of capital and around 50 million of other funding to try and drive this sector forward, and the fact that we've been supporting the market for the last 7 years and have plans to support it for the remainder of this decade, really highlights that actually there is long-term certainty. So I guess I'll just leave you with the kind of final thought, which is the opportunity we think is here and now, and what we really want to hear is investment committees starting to ask questions about why you're not investing in heat networks in the UK. That would be a fantastic success for us, and I hope today goes some way to helping those ICs ask those questions. There's some more slides about government support, which will come around in the fuller slide pack. But that's me done for today, and I'll hand back to Sam or over to Ken.
Perfect. Thank you, John. Just to highlight to everyone on screen some of the key contacts for you within BEIS, and also within the Triple Point Heat Networks investment management team as well. These slides will be circulated after the session. Great, so I will now hand over to Ken to give us a little bit of an update on the story so far in relation to HNIP.
Morning, everyone. Thrilled to see so many. I'm going to make this a whistle-stop tour. I've got far more slides than minutes available to me. So as Sam said, this is HNIP, the story so far, and a window in what's to come. Let's get started. Sam, next slide. Thank you. So John spoke quite a bit about this. The heat network investment project that we're managing was conceived against a backdrop of the UK's carbon reduction targets. And those targets were made much more demanding still in 2019 when we became the first major economy to commit to net zero emissions by 2050. I doubt that was news to any of you. Had you heard it yesterday? If it was, then the fact that your TV screens and newspapers have been covered with Boris's green industrial revolution this morning means it certainly won't be news now. Next slide, Sam, please. What might be news, and it continues to surprise many, is quite the extent to which heat is the biggest villain of the piece. It's our single biggest source of CO2 emissions here in the UK, and worse than that, it is undoubtedly our toughest nut to crack. And another problem is the one represented by our built environment, the particular challenge of decarbonising our homes. I heard a fascinating presentation by MHCLG yesterday afternoon, and they described the fact that one of the toughest challenges we have is acknowledging that we are, all of us, a big part of the problem. This is not something that is an ill associated with smoke spewing big businesses. It's the boilers in our homes that are contributing to these carbon emissions. It's the little white box in the corner of our Englishmen's castles that need to be cured. Next slide, Sam, please. But if that's all bad news, there is tremendous opportunity, as John said to you, and I'm going to update my slide to round this up to 3. It presents a tremendous opportunity. Heat networks are still in their relative infancy here in the UK. We've got something like 40 of them. But our big target and our realistic goal is to hit or exceed the 18% that the CCC think heat networks could contribute to the decarbonisation of heating in the UK. There's no silver bullet for this. There is much conversation already around the long-term role that hydrogen and electrification will play in time. But heat networks are the bit of the puzzle we can and frankly must be getting on with today. So what of HNIP? Well, HNIP is a major government contract. It seeks to invest £320 million of capital funding into heat network projects. More than that, though, and the rationale for having so many of you here today is that we want to leverage in around £1 billion of private investment alongside that. As John said, the aim of HNIP was to create the conditions for a self-sustaining heat network market, one that contributes to the decarbonisation of the UK economy by 2050. With regret, that is beyond HNIP alone now. As John was saying, that's proven to be a bridge too far. The good news for the market is that there is substantial follow-on funding in the form of the Green Heat Network Fund, in the form of the Public Sector Decarbonisation Fund. But far from failing, we have fulfilled our brief in already increasing the volume of strategic, optimised, good quality, low carbon heat networks. We've increased and improved the quality of those networks. And really importantly, we're continuing to build the capability and capacity, not just of project sponsors, but in time of the supply chain here in the UK as well. And this is the team that's delivering for you. I'm Ken Hunnisett from Triple Point. We sit in the middle as the prime contractor to BEIS, but this is a big solution that needs a lot of delivery, and there's a multidisciplinary team from around industry. We have technical assessment and support from our friends at AECOM. John mentioned earlier the SOMS and SDDS pack that was pulled together by LuxNova and Amberside separately. You've met Sam already this morning from Acuity Consulting, our stakeholder group. And we have an accounting team, the team from Asteros, who provide a techno-economic assessment modelling, and a business called GemServe, who provides our applicants with support throughout the process and manages our application systems as well. Next slide, Sam. So what is HNIP? Well, HNIP is grant and loan gap funding. The gap in this instance is the gap that exists between an economically viable project, a project that might have a pre-intervention IRR that's greater than 0, but one that's demonstrably not commercially viable. We bridge that gap, we top it up, we enhance those returns so that they are investable and can be brought forward. Grants are self-explanatory, but we have two types of loans, and in the current loan interest rate environment, they have never been cheaper. So we have a corporate loan, which is a loan that's made directly to investment grade borrowers or to the public sector. That at the moment carries 0.01% per annum. So all but interest free. It's available for tenors of up to 25 years. We also have a project loan, a loan that can be made directly to special purpose vehicle companies, project companies, or indeed non-investment grade borrowers. Even that is just 1% per annum, again, over the same tenor. So incredibly cheap loan funding. John mentioned a historic reliance in the market on public work loan board debt. In fact, our loans to the public sector are even cheaper still. Next slide, Sam, please. And the next one. Thank you. So we've been at this for a little while now. HNIP funding is awarded in quarterly competitions. We have just had the investment committee for the 7th of those. So really pleasingly, these numbers are already a little out of date, and you should expect to get an announcement soon of some more exciting projects that we can add. We have nevertheless got something like £125 million worth of projects announced in the market already. Really pleasingly, 60 million of those actually under contract. We talk a lot about making awards. I think when we spoke to you at this conference last year, that's all we were talking about. It's important that you understand real money is flowing down to these projects as well. The projects that we're making awards to are moving through their commercialization. Some indeed are moving on to their construction phase already. It's been a paralysing year, 2020, with all that's been thrown at us, but it has, in some instances, created the conditions for some of these projects to move forward at pace. You might see there, if your eyesight is good enough or your screen is big enough, Leeds City Council up in the top right-hand corner. Leeds have done a fantastic job of building out their project at greater pace, precisely because of the pandemic. Roads have been empty, less traffic on them. They've been able to move forward with those city centre works. Next slide, Sam, please. And some more of the numbers that matter. Those projects will, in time, when they're all constructed, deliver something in excess of 300 gigawatts of heat already, to something like 40,000 homes across pipes with a length of around 115 kilometres. I mentioned there have been £125 million worth of awards. That's already in project cap, £8 million. You can see it's carbon. Those are the direct metrics. They're the figures we are very proud of, but there are other wider benefits too that are already becoming obvious to us. Next slide, Sam. And in the context of the green recovery, there can't really be very many more important things than the extent to which this is able to contribute to economic growth nationally and internationally. In some work undertaken by the Local Government Association and the Institute for Public Policy Research, they estimated that something like 700,000 jobs could be created on the transition to a net zero economy. Doubtless that's a number they will only revise upwards after news of all this new government stimulus overnight. Of that 700,000, we think as many as 81,000 could be directly attributed to heat networks. I mentioned the Leeds project to you just moments ago. If that's a slightly nebulous number, 81,000 and 700,000, that I can tell you right now that as a result of the investments already made in Leeds, we've seen 430 jobs already created, a number of which are apprentices doing fantastic work today. You can see behind the picture there already. But this is a big ask. Next slide, Sam, please. John mentioned this number to you already this morning. So you can see we are nicely joined up. It's a publicly referenceable number. We think this is going to take something like £22 billion worth of capital investment if we're going to fulfill our expectations and the CCC's expectations of what the potential for this market is. And clearly, despite huge support, this can't be funded by public funds alone. Nor, in fact, should it. I've spoken about some of the positive consequences of this dreadful pandemic. The reality is, of course, that our public finances are in a pretty parlous state. At the same time, public sector net borrowing was at record levels in September, this at a time when government tax receipts are estimated to be at their lowest level since records began as well. Public debt now was something like £260 billion in the first 6 months of the financial year. Not good numbers, not happy reading under any set of circumstances. And this at a time when PWLB debt, for all its availability, remains at a relative historic high since the rise back in October 2019. And of course, the ways in which we might have funded this infrastructure in the past, through the likes of PFI and PF2, have now been consigned to history. Next slide, Sam. So there's an obvious need for private capital. Government's calling for it, developers are calling for it. The National Infrastructure Plan, when it was last published, called for about £483 billion worth of funding requirement in its infrastructure pipeline out to 2021. And you all have pretty deep pockets. There is something like 120 trillion under management in global pension funds alone. Surprising then that the OECD estimates that just 1.6% of it is currently invested in infrastructure assets. In the statements in that report, the NIC stated that financing itself is not in short supply. That's a message we hear not infrequently. However, state financing institutions have to help to encourage private investment and catalyse activity. And that's really at the heart of what we're trying to do with HNIP. We're catalysing investment in this fantastic opportunity. Next slide, Sam. Next slide, Sam. Thank you. But if the money's to go in, there are first perhaps some hurdles to be overcome. And John spoke to several of these in his "You Said, We Did" section. In the Heat Network Building a Market Framework consultation that went out to the market and was then later published, it revealed several challenges that could conceivably have prevented or been a barrier to private sector investment in the types of numbers we're talking about. There was a perception of a relatively low visibility of the market and of a pipeline of investable projects. There was a perception of financial burden and of financial risk as a result of complex market arrangements and a lack of standardization, limited understanding of cost and return on investment, and at the time, in some quarters, a low reputation in the sector, with one or two poor consumer experiences. And this risk as well of connection risk, the notion that if we build it, will they really come? Next slide, please, Sam. Well, the good news is that that's all now being addressed. Really pleasingly, that market consultation seemed to signal on a near time horizon the prospect of regulation imminently, the prospect of the appointment of an experienced regulator, almost certainly Ofgem. What will they bring? Well, they'll bring market information. They'll seek to lower the developer burden. They've spoken about their intent to do precisely that. They'll seek to establish some kind of right and power parity with other utilities and increase the devolution to local authorities. In particular, they're going to seek to embrace a flexible approach to accommodate emergent business models. Emergent business models we're already seeing coming forward in the context of HNIP, which is super exciting. Next slide, Sam. So the good news is we're starting to see all those things now be addressed in a really quite tangible way. John spoke to you about the overall pipeline of projects. Here in the context of HNIP alone, we're seeing numbers that are trending upwards all the time. Over on the right-hand side of that graph, you can see now that at the end of the second quarter of 2020, just in our HNIP pipeline alone, we had £650 million worth of capex of projects in commercialisation, in construction that had applied for HNIP funding. Numbers that are only going up all the way still, and proving that there will be a fantastic pipeline of projects for those successor stimulus packages when they arrive in short order. We are fulfilling the brief to professionalise the market as well. I'm not going to talk to this slide very much. John spoke to you about the SOMS pack, the SDDS pack. I can tell you that we're already seeing evidence of those being used now, which is to say that we're already seeing evidence of projects saving money, saving time, and bringing forward consistent, replicable, scalable business models that ought to create the template for the investment proposition that we think this market should be. Next slide, Sam. Now, I could very well, and did in fact, pinch a few of those slides from a presentation I gave just 6 months ago. And since then, while they all still hold true today, it is true that the world has changed, not insubstantially, since we last came together as a group 12 months ago. Brexit continues to affect us and continues to affect the heat network market here in the UK. The economic consequences of Brexit might yet prove to look like a rounding error in the context of the economic consequences of the pandemic. but still it will affect us now, it will affect us in the future. There was a vote across the pond a little while ago, and most right-minded people are now accepting of the vote there, and the fact that that was going to see a change in the White House. That feels like it ought to be a really for the change is all these things are happening on. Still, we are in the grips of the pandemic. Next slide, Sam. Next slide, Sam, please. Sam, next slide, please. Thank you. If there has been unprecedented change, now, of course, there is an unprecedented response. I prepared these slides yesterday. It was never more truer than it had proven to be overnight. With news of the green industrial recovery, news of the additional financial stimulus that's been made available. So we're seeing fantastic national and international leadership now. That's the role of central government. It's the role of central government to provide policy frameworks in which the industry can grow. It's the role of government, and a role that it is demonstrably keen to perform, that it will deliver additional financial stimulus. Next slide, Sam. But this isn't just about working with central government. The great thing we've seen in our local authority projects today is that it's a role that they can play in making these things a success, and that should be interesting to an investor community that's got a long and a happy track record of engaging with local authorities. They provide stellar local political support and leadership. They have the unique ability to engage with their citizenship, to engage with private individuals, but also to engage with businesses in all energy vectors, not just heating, but transport and power as well. They encourage local economic growth. And if it's true that central government has the policy levers on planning and procurement, then it's the local competencies and the local delivery of it that are key to making some of these networks a success. And really, really importantly for all of you, there has demonstrably been around the public sector a real willingness to engage and partner with private sector investment. Last time, thank you. And last slide, please. Next one, Sam. So that brings us right up to date. Not very much more from me to say, except that we are going to carry on doing what we're doing now. We're focusing on delivering the project for BEIS and ensuring the delivery of all of those projects that I described to you. We are going to do that now through the remaining funding rounds, and we're right at the business end of HNIP. HNIP closes in March 22, it closes for full applications in October 21. We have just 4 more funding rounds available to us now, but a good availability of funding throughout those. To get that funding deployed, to ensure the success of those projects, we need to keep up this level of ongoing stakeholder engagement. Of course, that means talking to applicants, historic ones and new ones that might come forward. It means speaking with the supply chain and the other actors in the industry, but it really means talking to you, the investors, the people who have the power, capacity, and I hope desire to want to take this opportunity forward in the years to come. And really excitingly, you're going to hear from Richard Turner, my colleague in the delivery partner group this afternoon, or sorry, balance of the morning, about the launch of BHIVE, the BEIS Heat Investment Vehicle. It's the launch of the framework that we hope you will participate in, that will provide you access to those projects, access to this really great opportunity. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Ken. I'm now going to hand over to Emma. I just wanted to apologise there for the slight delay on slide transfer. The internet here isn't amazing, it seems. So Emma, I'll hand over to you.
Cheers, thank you, Sam, and hopefully everyone can see me now. Quite a nice transition actually, with John starting with the public capital Ken then giving us the view of the blended capital, so that's public and private coming together. And I think the focus for my talk today is going to be around how private finance can actually support the rollout of heat networks. Now, I normally like to start these kind of talks with an overview of the science, because the science is just so critical in tackling climate change. But the fact that everybody's actually here on this call makes me think that we all know that the climate crisis is impending, it's going to be incredibly disruptive, and we need to act quickly to tackle it. So instead, I think I'll start the story, as you see on the next slide, at 2015 with the signing of the Paris Agreement. So this was obviously an enormous global moment when we saw governments come together to actually commit to tackling climate change. And it really kickstarted action, not just in the political sphere, but also in the public sphere and in media. So last year really did hit a high watermark in terms of attention on climate change. As you'll see on the next slide, Sam, if you're happy to move forward, thank you. 2019 really was the high watermark. We had the galvanizing speeches by Greta Thunberg, we had the global climate strikes, and it really signaled a call to action that consumers, investors, etc., wanted action on climate change. And this call to action has really been adopted by the finance sector, which has been really driving forward what I like to call the green finance revolution. Now, we at the Green Finance Institute like to view green finance in two buckets. One is greening finance, and the other is financing green. So on greening finance, as you'll see on the next slide, this is all around enhancing the role of financial actors in managing the risks and disclosure from a transition to a low carbon economy. Now, this was kickstarted by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which many of you will be familiar with, which provided a framework for disclosure associated with climate change. Over 1,000 organisations have now adopted the TCFD recommendations, with over 11 billion market cap backing this. And it was fantastic that last week at the Green Horizons Summit that Rishi Sunak announced the fact that the TCFD recommendations are going to be becoming mandatory within the UK. Greening finance, as well as focusing on disclosure and reporting, also focuses on the appropriate management of risks. And this is very much based on having suitable taxonomies for what is green. So again, we really welcome the announcement of the UK developing a leading green taxonomy. But I think we're here today to actually talk about the other side of green finance, which, as you see on the next slide, is financing green. This is all around how do you get public, and in this instance, private capital, to move in environmentally positive. And the Green Finance Institute sits right fair and squarely within the financing green space. We were set up last year by the UK government and the City of London Corporation to act as a catalyst and a forum between the public and private sectors to drive finance. And we achieved this by convening coalitions of leading experts drawn from the finance sector, but also drawn from business, energy, property, civil society, academia, etc., to try and bring these experts together to design, develop and deploy new funding mechanisms that can channel capital into low carbon activities. Now again, green finance or financing green, what does this mean? In a nutshell, it's bonds, loans, funds, indices, etc., financing assets and mechanisms that are deploying capital towards a tracked, environmentally positive outcome. That's it in a nutshell. And the sector has a very, very strong track record, originality and scale. Within the space of just 10 years, the green finance market went from being a niche financial subsector, dominated mainly by small funds looking at renewable energy, through to an almost institutionalized market today. And today's announcement of the PM's 10-point plan clearly included a drive for green finance. So we hope that green finance will be the mainstream very soon. So anyway, why am I introducing green finance? Well, I think the challenges of the built environment are a very, very suitable counterpart for the opportunities that green finance can unlock. So as you'll see on the next slide, the built environment is responsible for 17% of global emissions, and actually in the UK it's responsible for almost 30% of emissions, the majority of which is actually dominated by energy use to heat our buildings. And with over 30% of residential buildings being developed before 1970, we have an enormous challenge to actually retrofit them to energy efficient standards and introduce zero carbon heating technologies within them. Government's own estimates suggest that over £65 billion of investment will be required by 2035, and that doesn't even include the investment for heat. So there's an enormous investment gap, and there is a sector that is desperate to go into, there's finance and investors who are desperate to go into green activities. And because of this, the Green Finance Institute decided to set up the Coalition for the Energy Efficiency of Buildings, which we'll see on the next slide. It's formed of over 200 individual members drawn from multiple different sectors, from business, finance, right through to the public sector. And its focus is on financing a net zero carbon and climate resilient built environment. Earlier on this year, we assessed the market for energy efficiency, looking at the barriers that owner-occupiers, private renters and social renters experience to renovating and retrofitting their properties. And then we designed a portfolio of financial solutions that could help unlock those barriers. And back in September, the coalition launched a 2-month task force called the Zero Carbon Heating Task Force that brought together 50 leading experts on the heating sector to replicate that approach within heating. So we looked at existing homes that were on and off the gas grid, new build homes and district heating networks, trying to understand what were the financial barriers to their rapid scale up, and then designing new financial products that could help to unlock those barriers. And next year, we're really excited to be continuing our work with our members to actually bring some of these ideas to market and demonstrate that they can generate commercial returns. So what do some of these ideas look like? Well, I've shown a couple of them on the next slide. So jumping around a few of them, one that we think has massive opportunity to help individuals to either install heat pumps or connect to district heating networks is property assessed clean energy financing. This is a well-known financing mechanism in the US and has mobilized over $6 billion towards retrofits and low carbon heating within the US and is being scaled out into Australia and piloted in Spain. Property assessed clean energy financing can provide up to 100% of the funding requirements for low carbon activities and is repaid over a long period, 20 years, 30 years, so it's highly affordable. But most importantly, the financing remains with the property rather than the individual. So when a homeowner moves house, they don't take any debt with them. It's actually whoever is living within the property and benefiting from the low carbon solutions, they will be the person who's repaying this. Another interesting opportunity to fund some of these low carbon activities is a green home salary sacrifice scheme. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Bike to Work scheme, and green home salary sacrifice works in a similar way. For activities that help to decarbonise homes, employees will be able to repay for the cost of those activities through gross salary contributions, which is obviously tax efficient, but also helps to drive low carbon technologies through employers where there's often a trusted relationship. The last one I'll talk around today is around community municipal investments, and this could be highly relevant for heat networks that are being rolled out across regional areas. So community municipal investments are an opportunity for local authorities to raise capital through a crowdfunding platform. So you, me, and many other people who have some have some savings that they'd like to invest would be able to invest into into a bond issued by their local authority. And you would be able to actually see that the proceeds of that fund were used for climate emergency activities, which could be the installation of heat networks in appropriate areas. Now, I really recommend that everyone takes the opportunity to read our forthcoming report with all of the findings from the Zero Carbon Heating Task Force. It provides a really detailed view of the barriers to financing various technologies across different tenures, and then the financing mechanisms that can help to overcome those barriers. But I'll just finish off with a few thoughts around what makes, or how private finance can support the rollout of heat networks and other low carbon heating technologies. So a couple of important tenets. One is that financial solutions do generate commercial returns, both for the financial actor, but are very attractive to the person who is borrowing or using the funds. So it's all around ensuring that the features of the finance are attractive to both parties. The second is around efficiently leveraging public capital. So where there are public funds, as we've seen announced today, available for the installation of heat networks, how can we that financial mechanisms leverage that capital to the greatest extent? And one thing that I'll go blue in the face talking around is guarantees, credit guarantees that could be provided by the government, where the OECD's own estimates show that guarantees can leverage in 8 to 10 times the private capital as to the public capital that's put in. And the last thing I'll say is that the financial solutions need to be highly scalable. So demonstrating that these solutions work in a single location is really important to attract in the market. But then actually showing that they can be scaled out across different regions or different tenures is where you'll start to get systemic change. So if finance underpins the transactions that we make across our economy, then green finance is what will underpin the transactions that we take to decarbonise our economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emma. I'll hand over to Caroline from the ADE.
Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Caroline. I'm the Head of Policy here at the Association for Decentralised Energy. We're a trade association representing heat networks as well as other sectors in the UK. I just wanted to add a few words on our perspective of where the industry is now, where it's going to go in the next few years, and the investment opportunity therein. As with many of the speakers this morning, I wanted to start with thinking about, why we're here and what we're trying to achieve to get to 2050 and the full potential that the heat network sector in the UK can realise in its contribution to net zero. I think, as we've already talked about, there is an enormous opportunity for heat networks, starting from a relatively small base compared to other countries. John said, regardless of whether, for example, we go with a hydrogen-led or an electrification-led approach to heat decarbonisation, or a patchwork of those, heat networks play a crucial role in any one of those routes. And we could be looking at between sort of 17 and 24% of domestic and non-heating demand in the next few decades. And as I said, that includes an enormous need for capital investment in the next few decades. As we've seen so far this morning, that 16 billion is already an extremely conservative estimate and will only grow, I think, as we fully start to get into and understand the growth within this market. I wanted to add to the comments that have been made this morning with talking a little bit about our view on what that market is going to look like and what we want to achieve in the next few years. Obviously, where we want to get to is that in the next few years, in the 2020s and beyond, heat networks are not only commercially viable, but they are thriving in the UK. And heat network infrastructure has the same similarly low risk profile as other forms of energy infrastructure and infrastructure more broadly. I think there are a number of things that it might be useful just to pull out in terms of what that market could look like. in the future. Firstly, I think it's really important that, as many of the speakers have already said this morning, and as Boris Johnson, I think, emphasised in his 10-point plan, we need not only a thriving market for new build and connections to heat networks in the UK, but also a really strong retrofit market to start to eat into what is the majority of domestic buildings and non-domestic buildings that we need to decarbonise. Going forward, heat networks will also be a mainstream part of the UK's zero carbon regulated infrastructure, and over the next few decades will transition to being 100% zero carbon. It's also important that we start to really build on already really good work to make sure that we have the skills and training that we need for the enormous growth in the workforce supporting heat networks and low carbon heating in general, both for the UK market and also overseas. I think just finally, the other things that I would pull out immediately are that over the next few years and a few decades, we will see the strategic siting of heat networks, particularly in towns and cities, where they are the most cost-effective way of decarbonising. And through that expansion of heat networks, they will be supporting broader systems integration as we decarbonise and play a really significant role in how we manage those systems, particularly in terms of their flexibility. So just to say very briefly where we are now and then where we want to get to. So next slide, please. As speakers have already mentioned, we have almost 500,000 customers on about 14,000 heat networks in the UK, around just above maybe 2% of heating demand, but most are communal in the UK with an average of about 31 dwellings per network. The district heating schemes that we do have, though, make a relatively strong contribution to the annual gigawatt hours of heating provided. So it's about 60 to 40% split in terms of communal and district right now. How are we now to where we want to be in the next few years and in the next few decades? I think it's really important as context for this discussion and the investment opportunity that exists now to say that the 2020s will be absolutely crucial for heat networks in the UK. At the minute, I think it's fair to say that most heat networks are primarily driven by planning policy and that there is a focus on new build at the minute, although we have notable developments on retrofit. In the next few years and in the 2020s, what the industry really wants to see is overarching strategies for building a retrofit market for low carbon heating, which we've already seen the 10-point plan. We also hope to see in the heat and building strategy. But more than that, we will also be seeing the people on the ground, the work going on that is needed to deliver that, and a real ramping up in that work over the next few years so that we can get to the point where we have a really strong retrofit market for low carbon heating going forward. I think the next thing that I would say is that in terms of where heat networks are being built, where they're being developed, is really driven by the support from local authorities, which is great. But we need to move to a situation where heat networks are being strategically developed and sited in areas where they are the most cost-effective way to decarbonise heating. And as John mentioned, and we are extremely supportive of, the consultation and then I hope introduction of zoning in the UK should do a great deal to support this. The next thing I would mention is that, as we've talked about previously this morning, there are voluntary standards at the minute for technical design of heat networks and customer protection through Heat Trust. In the next few years and into the 2020s, we'll see the establishment of proportionate and effective regulation across the heat network sector. And what we want is that that brings heat network infrastructure more in line with other forms of energy infrastructure and also mitigate some of the investment risks that we still see. That means that over the next few years to 2020 and beyond, heat networks will truly be a mainstream of the UK's connected infrastructure, and we will see a similarly low risk profile as other forms of infrastructure in the UK. Next slide. The other things I would mention, so heat networks at the minute, as with heating in the UK more generally, are primarily fueled by natural gas. Over the next few years, through the 20s, we will see a mix of cost reduction, support and regulation that makes decarbonising heating more commercially viable than fossil fuels, so that we can achieve our ambitions that by, say, for example, the kind of early to mid 2030s, we are looking at 100% net zero carbon heat networks. Moving on, so just the final points again that I would make. I think, as I mentioned, there are some areas, particularly for some areas of training and skills in low carbon heat more generally, where it is somewhat company-led at the minute, and there are some gaps. There is already enormous amounts of work government to address this and to create and establish training courses to fill those gaps, to make sure that we have the training in place both for new recruits coming forward and also retraining for the transition to net zero carbon heat to build the workforce in the UK. The final thing that I would mention is that it's always important, I think, also to bear in mind that heat networks play a significant role in the broader energy system and how we transition to net zero. I think one of the most concrete ways in which they will do that is the way in which their flexibility can be used to support the broader systems, and particularly to support a decarbonised power system. At the minute, there are many schemes with thermal stores and who are using their generation flexibly already. But I think there's more that we can do here. And over the next few years, what I really want to see is that the financial value of heat network storage and broader flexibility is very well understood by government and industry, and that going forward, heat networks are making a really significant contribution towards balancing of a net zero energy system and are rewarded for it. If you move on to the next slide, please. So just to, as a few concluding remarks from myself, I think the work that industry and government have done over the last few years has been remarkable. You've heard the uptake of HNIP and the government work that is going on. I think it is fair to say, though, that we need to continue to build the amount and the deployment of heat networks in the UK if we are to reach the potential that they have. It's also, I think, fair to say that at the minute, heat networks still have a slightly higher risk than they should as long-term infrastructure projects, and that particularly larger heat network projects are still mostly local authority-led with the private sector. I think going forward, all that you have heard today shows that the 2020s will need to see an enormous increase in capital investment in the heat network sector. And that what we will see is that regulation, broader policy intervention, and also work by industry will reduce the risk of investment, improve returns to drive up the scale of what we are doing here in the UK. That means a significant increase in the deployment, particularly of larger district heating networks, but also of communal heat networks, and also the continued role of local authorities, but many more private-led heat network schemes too. To conclude briefly, I think the heat network in the UK is a really significant investment opportunity right now. It will be in the next few years, and there is a very clear pathway to enormous scaling up through the 2020s and beyond to net zero. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Caroline. I'll just hand over to James from the Department for International Trade.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for giving me some time to share with you my views from the Department for International Trade. I have to say I'm really missing your event because I remember them being the best biscuits of the year last year. So I'm having to make do with my own ones at home, which, as you can see, I'm eating too many of anyhow. So I've got just a few slides to share with you. And actually, they're really a summary of what's been said before, but perhaps somewhat more, just taking a next level of enthusiasm. So there are two real sources of information. I've just posted the links, I think, in the chat. You know, the BEIS pipeline that John's team have been working on for, what was it, the last 5-6 years, you know, it's pushing towards £2 billion now of projects coming through that process. You know, Ken's already outlined the projects that Triple Point have been investing in and the pipeline that they drive forward. And a couple of graphics there just showing where the pipeline is and where the projects are being based across the UK. You know, this is something that really is accelerating significantly, and something that I know some of you have been supporting us with over at the DIT. We're actually trying to bring this all together in what's called high potential opportunity, and we're focusing on the northeastern Teesside to show actually some £300 million worth of projects are coming in to that area, and how can it stimulate investment going forward. But I know many of you on the call know many of the projects intimately. But you know, of those £2 billion, which ones you know, would I be looking at? Would I be thinking of where they're going? Well, I think you know, Bristol is an incredibly exciting area. The way they're trying to go about decarbonising the area, and heat networks play a massive role in that. I think what's going on at Middlesbrough is really interesting. I think that's going to be a strong project going forward, and you know, one of the pioneer areas in Gateshead. That's really good to look at what they've done, but also what they're planning on doing going forward. And then with Energetic on the Meridian Water, another exciting development. You know, and within that, you've got established incumbent organisations like ENGIE, who've taken forward the Newcastle tender they won the year before last. But you know, obviously they're a substantial incumbent investor in the UK. Through Birmingham, Coventry, and the Olympic Park, and it'll be interesting to see how they take development forward. But what we're seeing now with Vattenfall, and very exciting how Vattenfall are coming into the market, what they're trying to do and talk about for the Riverside projects with Corrie, using energy from waste, and the Midlothian project in Scotland. And I think just last week as well, they announced this strategic partnership with Viridor to access massive amounts of available heat from energy and waste. Really shows the scale at which this industry is rapidly changing. So on my next slide, what I try and do is paint an indicative picture of actually, I see all these projects really multiplying up and driving forward in the coming years. And pretty much this year, even with the challenges, we're seeing probably around about £200 million being invested in existing projects or new projects, heat network projects in the UK. And we think that's probably doubled over the last 4 or 5 years. And if you take that sort of grey, and apologies for the awful colours on the slide here, but if we take that grey line, see how that established market continues to grow. And then in yellow, if we put this slug of new projects that Ken's bringing in on heat networks, you know, we're probably seeing in the next few years, and probably sooner than that, you know, the doubling of the current market. And I think we're seeing some real challenges that's putting into the supply chain, but it's also providing plenty of opportunities. So we've got this immediate opportunity to develop the market going forward. We've got the Green Heat Network Fund that's going to be following on in that vein, you know, possibly stabilising, possibly pushing forward. But then we think about, and sorry, we haven't got the graph showing these other two, but on this one, I'm talking about if zoning comes in, you know, I could see how that helps accelerate the market going forward. And this top one is the city decarbonisation agenda. I should remember the statistic, but I haven't got it to hand, of how many local authorities have declared climate emergencies. Pretty much all of those that have are looking at how they can decarbonise with heat networks. So I'm painting a picture here, you know, whether we get to £1 billion, it needs to be of a massive different scale that we're on now if we're going to decarbonise heat. And I think, you know, that presents a wonderful opportunity for both incumbent but new investors to move forward. what I've got on my next slide is a breakdown of accessing the data BEIS has got, and what I've done here on this sort of starburst is not included the capital cost to bring forward a new heat solution, because they're so variable for projects. It might be a very large, historically a very large gas CHP, which would cost multi-million pounds, or it might simply be accessing energy from waste heat, which is obviously going to be a lot cheaper. So I'm not talking about how much it costs to generate heat and the capital infrastructure. I'm not talking about operations and maintenance. I'm thinking about the breakdown of the development and management and creation of the project, how much it costs to actually access the heat, how much it costs to install and build that heat network, and then how much it costs to deliver to those heating to those customers. And I mean, it doesn't break down into quarters, but I think the one that I see as a real one that we can really work some efficiency into is the significant amount that we're currently spending on development and management. And I expect to see a lot of learning from these projects, making that cost base come forward. But within that as well, I also see an awful lot of money we're spending on importing a lot of things in the UK, and sort of 10-15% of the heat pipe costs is importing it from Europe. No reason why we shouldn't have an efficient factory in the UK building these pipes, re-establishing a different price and helping drive the industry forward. So I see a massive opportunity to land new investments in the coming weeks, months and years to deliver this massive growth in heat networks. Which brings me onto my last slide. Here at the Department for International Trade, we're here to help both established investors from overseas in the UK, but also help with new investors coming into the UK. You've got my contact details there on the slide, how to get in touch with me. We have posts in your host country. We will have capable people that can help you navigate issues from your side of the world. I work in the London team. I'm a specialist with them, and I help on the competencies coming forward. But we also have a fleet of people in the investment services team that help the process, help on the mechanics of understanding some of the top level issues on tax or office location, or providing some insights into business development or into legal challenges. We can really help answer a lot of your questions there. And then as we spread out across the UK, we have local representatives or partner organisations that can help you across the UK, be it in North East Scotland or Northern Ireland. So we're a machine that can help you. From my point of view, what I've heard today and what I believe and what I'm overly enthusiastic about is look, this market needs your money. It needs your capability. It needs your capacity. It needs your innovation. We need to realise cost reductions to drive this forward. We need a more efficient heat networks. We need more developer-led, but sort of the owner's operator model coming through. And I've started to see the first couple of projects that are bringing in finance at the construction phase, and effectively operating that network. Something that's worked amazingly well in offshore wind, that's allowed us to bring in about £30 billion of investment into offshore wind, and I'm seeing heat network models develop on those sides as well. We need to reduce the project risks. That reduces the finance cost. I think there's a real opportunity to bring in standardized design, constructions, operations. It makes investing in them a lot easier. It means we can package up projects and turn them into £100 million solutions rather than individual £10 million ones. And I think we're going to see, digitally augmented, smartest, most innovative heat networks being delivered in the UK. And within that, we're going to industrialise the networks. We're going to be a world-leading specialist in this area, and the other side of DIT is going to be very keen to support these companies export that capability overseas. So I'm here to help. We have a whole team here to help, and I hope I've been caught up some of the time, and I hope it's been interesting. And my email address has just been posted there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, James. We're due to have a Q&A now, but as we're a little bit behind time and there's been quite a lot of chat and responses to questions within the discussion forum, we're going to skip the formal Q&A session. There will be time to ask questions at the end to all of our speakers. So I will welcome Tim from Ancala to give an investor perspective.
Thank you very much, everyone. I'm just checking that this is working. Testing.
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Hear me? Wonderful. Okay. Well, good morning. Thank you for having me. I believe I've got. Do I have 15 minutes or less?
If you could do 10, that would be wonderful.
Okay,
but
I'll do my best.
I can push to 15 if needed.
Sorry. Okay, no trouble. So for those on the call that don't know me, I'm a director with Ancala Partners based in London. We are a European infrastructure manager managing around 2.7 billion euros in capital, and that is invested across both the UK and Europe, but quite heavily in the UK. And that is invested across a mixture of utilities, energy infrastructure, telecommunications, transport, and healthcare. That being said, as I noted, we're very heavily invested in utilities and energy infrastructure. And one of those core investments is into a business named Leap Utilities. Leap Utilities is a multi-utility owner and operator based in the UK. It has existing district heating network investments, in particular Media City, based in Salford and in Manchester, which is host to the BBC's head office. And that is one of our core heat projects. As an investor, and with the backing of Ancala funds and with a very long-term horizon, we are doing everything we can to drive Leap in a sustainable direction. So, that is building out our electric networks, our water networks, and in particular district heating networks. So Ancala has got behind Leap, not just with capital, but with resources to bid on new across the UK. And that is required because to procure one of these projects, as people on the call will know, requires a very multidisciplinary skill set. It's not just bidding on a project and then putting pipes in the ground. It's a end-to-end supply chain and execution, almost like a transaction in itself. So Leap is heavily involved in several projects, and one in particular. And I think we've got some battle stories that we can that I'll talk to very briefly today. But we're excited and long-term investors in UK heat, and we're very keen to be involved in the process, which very much is a process. So I think my agenda for the day, and I've only got around 8 minutes left, is on the screen. Just a very quick summary on what we view as being infrastructure market trends at the moment, and how that's relevant for heat. So COVID, if anything, has made the market for infrastructure hotter. Unless you're talking airports, beyond that, there's been a compression of yields again on account of rate cuts, and further money that is spilling into the sector on account of the inability to get a reasonable return on, let's say, safer investments such as fixed interest or bonds. So infrastructure has become a bond proxy in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, but even more so now with yields where they are. Particularly direct pension plans are looking at their investment alternatives and pushing more and more money toward infrastructure because it looks like a safe place to invest to achieve reliable returns that are a whole lot better than 0% in the bank. And I think what we're seeing on account of that is more and more money chasing fewer and fewer assets. And so creating new asset classes, which is exactly what's happening with UK heat, becomes a very interesting development for that money. And as I'll explain shortly, there are things that are needed to be done to better unlock that market, to make it accessible to that money. But I think nonetheless, it is a strong trend and a very useful trend. What I would say, I think, in respect to heat and trends again, is that in Europe, you're seeing heat networks in the Nordics and Western Europe go for a song. So people are bidding networks in those parts at crazy numbers, 20 to 30 times earnings, 6 to 8% returns. And it's actually, as I said earlier, very hard to be competitive in processes like that, where it really is a cost of capital shootout. Now, where we are in the UK presents quite an opportunity, because we're nowhere near that level, in our view, in terms of the level of operational heat networks providing baseload heat to homes, commercial and industrial developments. So Europe is definitely ahead of the curve, and we are chasing that curve. But what it does mean is that the money that gets in now, provided it's investing in projects that have a decent underwrite and decent contractual protections, we're investing at higher returns now, and we should be, because of the risks involved in getting this industry properly kick-started. But you could see a scenario where, once the networks that have been financed and backed by Triple Point and BEIS and the other stakeholders are up and running, you are creating an industry that will see the same yield compression, that will see assets that were trading at 10 and 12% trading at 6 and 8%. And so there is an opportunity for the early movers to access that ability, or that trend, I should say. On the flip side, you need to be careful as well, because the early money can often be burnt. They often say that the first few owners of infrastructure are the ones that lose the money. So you'd rather be the second or the third owner. And that's why you need to be very, very smart about the underwrite case for investments in this sector, just as you would in any other sector. So on the UK specifically, I've referenced why, as this is my second bullet point, I've referenced why it is an attractive opportunity. So it's a place where the piles of capital that are building can find a home at a higher return at a time when all of the typical assets in the utility space and the typical infrastructure space, or the heat networks in Europe, are going for crazily low yields. So there is an opportunity to target higher returns, but it comes with greenfield and construction risk. It also comes with some geopolitical risk in terms of the planning and the arrangements that are set up in the UK to drive heat investment. But the UK, for the reasons I've noted, is an attractive opportunity for investors like us. One thing I would say in terms of challenges in the UK market is that we need to see more clarity, and I think the government and the various institutions are very tied up right now with probably bigger fish to fry. We are seeing some good developments, and of course there's the 2025 no new gas connections to homes, which is, I'm told, been brought forward in an announcement yesterday. But we do need more clarity on what that looks like, because you do have developers out there that would prefer to just get gas up and running and get their homes built and sold over the next 3 to 5 years at pace. They don't want to be slowed down, at least during that period, on investing in renewable fueled heat networks, because there is lead time and there is complexity. And it's very easy for those developers to quote the fact that there is not a whole lot of, let's say, hardwired factual obligations that have come out of government as to what they must do and precisely what percentage of renewable fuel must fuel their homes, and how the building regulations will work in that context. So there is a bit of an information vacuum, and it does play to the developer's hand for those developers that aren't necessarily looking positively upon heat network investment, because in their view it's just slowing them down. So there is, to some degree, a need for further, as I said, information and further, I would say, obligation that need to develop from government, and it's all going in the right direction. And as I've mentioned, I do think they've got bigger fish to fry at the moment. So I expect there's a lot going on in the background, and we will watch that space for more definitive announcements. I think the other thing in the UK is it's not at this stage, it's not a planning-led network in all cases. So, there are developers who are, have bespoke planning arrangements. They, in our experience, some developers have, if they're developing anytime between now and in 2025 or thereafter, they have an obligation to take a heat network if it's viable. They might have an obligation to take a heat network if it's available at the time they achieve their planning. And then others may have an obligation, a hard obligation, to take a heat network. And in our experience, it has been very difficult because most heat networks may need more than one anchor load to get up and running. And I have various customers who have various deals with their council counterparts and various incentives or disincentives makes getting a large network that requires multiple counterparties to an economic state very, very difficult. So I think I've started with the positives, and there are many, and we are, as I think in the presentation just gone, we're at the front of a bow wave of opportunity and investment. But at the same time, heat networks and any good infrastructure asset to develop into a proper market requires strong offtake. And at the moment, there are some very positive and very progressive developers who are that strong offtake, who believe in heat networks, and they believe in the corporate social responsibility and sustainability requirements that brings. But then there are those that just want to build homes and get them sold and get them out the door as quickly as possible, and they're not being wrapped over the knuckles hard enough, to be honest, to drive forward the investment that is required if we want to hit our decarbonisation initiatives. So that's a bit of a summary on the UK in our experience. I might just quickly run through the last, because I've now sort of hit my time, so I've probably got 3 or 4 minutes left. I've got a note here on hunting for the ideal project, and I've talked to some of these points, but given some painful experience that we have had with projects where the counterparties are misaligned and are able to potentially make our lives difficult in committing capital to a project where the demand side is not well tied down. I think our experience is that the preferred project would be one that has a simple offtake with a single customer that is a committed customer, that is a believer in climate change and the requirements needed for that to be dealt with. And so identifying a strong counterparty that is positively motivated to take the heat on a long-term basis, who recognises that a gas counterfactual is no longer a reasonable counterfactual, that's a very important start. And then the other point, as I've referenced, is making sure that their planning obligations are, particularly if they are not a public entity, are in with that demand being a stable source to count on to get the project up. And then also the other, and it's very simple, I mean, it's offtake and it's input. So the offtake, as I've said, is supremely important. The input is supremely important. So, you need to have an identified heat source, and it needs to have enough renewable fuel guaranteed to be able to satisfy both the requirements that we know of today, as well as the potential requirements that could eventuate in the future. And that is difficult, as I said earlier, because it's not super clear right now if you go looking for what the 2025 or the 2023 building regs will require of renewable fuel in heat networks. And so, people are talking obviously plenty about air source heat pumps and other types of heat pump technology, lots of discussion about hydrogen. A lot of this technology is still developing. Some of it is here today and present and available. But you do need a heat source that is identified, that is able to be easily explained to the off-taker, and that you believe has a very strong chance of not just achieving the renewable fuel requirements of the currently understood obligations, but where it's likely to go once the building regs in 2023, if that is now the case, are more definitively known. So I think the other point I would make as an investor is projects that build out on a shorter term basis, high rises or industrial or commercial loads, they will be more economic than projects that build out on a very long term basis. So domestic estate style projects with 10 or 15 year build out timeframes, they're the perfect projects for achieving the decarbonisation initiatives of this country. But economically, building a spine to a very, very long network is a very expensive exercise. And that is exactly where the BEIS and triple point funding becomes very important, because no investor is going to make that investment in its own right with such a long payback. So I think those are 3 points I would mention in terms of hunting for the ideal projects. And my last bullet point was on HNIP itself, and a brief summary of our experiences to date and where we see things going. I would suggest that BEIS, as a supporter, and HNIP and all the key stakeholders with triple point leading the charge, have been very, very supportive. And in the engagements that we have had with them, it's very clear that they want to see this move forward with gusto. I think there's a few constraints that everyone is facing. I think having funding that is only available for another few years is difficult to match with projects that may be multi-decade projects. So having to draw down funding early, ahead of the potential construction timeline of a project and incur interest on that early does have some implications for long-lived projects. But I think my overarching statement is a highly supportive framework within the constraints of the funding that is currently available, and I expect that more funding will become available because of the success of this first initiative. I think one other aspect that we have dealt with is both that there's the time constraints around the funding itself and matching that to projects which are much longer dated in tenure. I think the legal architecture also, that is being put in place around these projects from a HNIP perspective also needs to have some regard to, every heat project is different, and it's not necessarily a cookie cutter approach. So there are certain frameworks and obligations within some of the legal documentation that we've seen around the funding, which lends itself better to very short-term projects that prove out within a few years, as opposed to projects that prove out over 5 to 10 to 15 to 20 years, such as some of the major projects that now exist in Europe. So I think our experience today has been wonderful in the sense of very supportive stakeholders who want to see this get done, and who understand that we are at the forefront here at the beginning of building an industry and a sector that has a real chance of becoming what is in existence in Europe already, which is a very stable, very well regarded investment asset class. And we're very excited to be a part of that, but it does come with its challenges, and early investing in this sort of sector with the parameters that we're currently facing, and which is moving goalposts and I guess a planning and a legal and a political drive that can flex by the day is not for the faint-hearted. But the early investors, I believe, who are doing the right things and underwriting projects appropriately will do very well. So that's it for me. I'm 2 minutes over my originally allotted time frame. So thank you very much for your time today, and I'll be around to take questions.
Thank you so much, Tim. I will now hand over to Richard and Alia to talk about the funding framework that we're really excited to tell you a little bit more about today.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. My name is Richard Turner. I am a director at Hunnisett Advisors, which is a financial advisory business that operates across both the renewables and infrastructure sectors. and we are part of the delivery partner group that works with Triple Point as the prime contractor to BEIS, and part of our role is around attracting third-party investment into the sector. So Aaliyah is from BEIS and can introduce herself for her part, but we're going to do a bit of a double act on BHIVE, which, as Ken mentioned, is the BEIS Heat Network Investment Vehicle that we're looking to establish, and that double act reflects the fact that we've been jointly developing BHIVE over the last months, and we'll give a bit of a whistle-stop tour, just explaining what BHIVE is. It's a dynamic purchasing system, DPS, why we're launching it, who can use it, both from a funder perspective and contracting authorities, a little bit about how it's expected to work, and then timing, and Aaliyah will talk a little bit about DPSs and what they are. So what is BHIVE DPS? Well, it's an OJU compliant procurement platform. We're expecting it to have a maximum value of around about 150 million, which is calculated against the investment funding that flows through it over its lifetime. And we're putting it in place to allow public sector heat network operators and developers in England and Wales, so it doesn't apply to Scotland, to procure asset finance, equity investment and equity investment related services for their heat network projects. It's important to say that it's separate to the heat network investment project, but it's being designed to work alongside both HNIP and any future government heat network support schemes. And I think that's a really important point, because we are aiming to attract investment into the market over the next few years. Heat networks still require government support, and so anything we put in place now needs to be able to work alongside that. BEIS is the administering authority, have a Triple Point as the prime contractor, will manage the DPS, and in reality, on a day-to-day basis, Amside advisors will be managing much of the DPS. So why are we procuring it? I won't talk about the first point. We've heard a lot about already this morning about the need for private capital if we're going to achieve the kinds of market growth that are anticipated. Ken mentioned the self-sustaining heat network market. We are not there. We are going to continue needing government support for projects in the near term, but we are putting building blocks in place to start to achieve that self-sustaining heat network market. So John mentioned the standardized due diligence set, the SOMs, the sales, operations and maintenance set. This BHIVE DPS is another building block that will allow capital into the market and help eventually achieve that self-sustaining heat network market. We hope it will be an efficient way for both public sector bodies to access private capital through an OJU compliant platform, but also for funders to access opportunities. So we wanted to become a marketplace, both for public sector and private investment to come together. And over time, we hope that will both reduce transaction and due diligence costs and lead to further standardization. I'll mention here, but I won't go into it any more detail, but the fact we're putting a DPS in place, which will have hopefully a range of interested investors and a process, means that we could also use that to support private sector sponsors and developers, but that wouldn't be through the OJU process. So who can use it? As I said, the DPS is designed, or DPSs generally are designed to bring together suppliers and customers. And in this case, the suppliers are funders, and we are looking to split the DPS into two lots. One is equity finance, and the second is asset finance. And we're hoping to attract a diverse range of funders, traditional lessors and asset financiers, financial investors such as Ancala, we've just heard from, but also industry investors. Lot 1 also covers provision of equity investment related services. So for public sector authorities who are procuring equity investment, that often comes with investment related services, which may be pre-financial close support through the commercialization stage, helping local authorities negotiate supply chain contracts, management of advisors, financial structuring, commercial structuring, etc., but also potentially post-financial close services such as SPV management services. But it's important to say that those services are ancillary to the equity investment. So this isn't a procurement vehicle for the design, construction or operations of a project, or for standalone professional services such as legal or financial services. They are services which come with the equity investment. So why are we putting in place? The main purpose is so that contracting authorities can use it to bring forward their projects and raise either asset finance or commercial investment. Contracting authorities covers all public sector bodies in England and Wales, as mentioned. That's central government departments, arm's length bodies and executive agencies, non-departmental public bodies, local authorities, NHS bodies, universities, colleges, schools, and also housing associations. And they could use it to finance new projects, new heat network projects, finance the expansion of existing heat networks, or potentially facilitate the sale of part or all of an investment in an existing mature heat network, which could be part of wider refinancing of that project. So there are a lot of heat networks already out there. Some of them are already in stable operations. So for a public sector body that wants to realise value in that, they could do that through this BHIVE DPS. And that stage for attracting investment could be projects at an early stage of commercialization where they need support from a strategic investor to help them further develop the project and drive it through commercialization to financial close. It could be for projects that are at late stage commercialization, or as I already mentioned, could be projects that are already in delivery or operations. So briefly how it will work, it's essentially a two-stage process. The first is appointment of funders onto the DPS, and that is intended to be a relatively straightforward process with a fairly simple selection questionnaire, which involves a fair amount of self-certification, and funders can apply for one or both lots depending on their capabilities. It's also important to say that this isn't like a traditional framework where you get a one-shot going onto the framework. Under a DPS, funders can apply to join it at any time during its life. So we're obviously looking to get funders signed up at an early stage so they can see maximum opportunity to see the opportunities, but suppliers can join throughout the life of the DPS. And then the second stage is once we have suppliers on board, is for contracting authorities to run competitions through the DPS, and that's called a call for competition. And they'll have competitions for each project, for each public sector body. And we, through TripPoint and AMSI, will support contracting authorities in running those competitions. So we'll support them in how to use the DPS, looking at whether their projects have sufficiently well developed and for investors and asset funders, and what kind of requirements those investors and funders might have. But the important thing is that contracting authorities will be running the competitions and will set the evaluation criteria and the bid requirements. So those competitions we run in a fairly traditional way. There'll be for the equity investment side, there'll be a call for competition tender pack with a tender document with bid response requirements, evaluation criteria. There'll be a fairly long form investment summary setting out the key characteristics of the project, and we'll include a sort of pro forma investment summary in the guidance documents. And there'll be a project development agreement which will set out the arrangements for how the project will be taken forward with the successful bidder through to eventual financial close of the project. and that'll include a draft shareholders agreement. For the asset finance side, probably a more straightforward process, again with a tender document, asset finance term sheet. And I've mentioned already that we'll support both, we'll be running the DPS both in terms of onboarding of funders and also supporting contracting authorities who want to use it. I won't go through this slide in any detail, but this is a sort of overview of how a competition might work. Worth pointing out, it's not a sort of single stage process exactly. There is potential for pre-market engagement built into the process, and also a capability assessment stage. But then there's a single final bid stage, after which contracting authority selects the winning funder. Just in terms of costs, so there is a fee that will accompany the use of the DPS. There's a 1% management levy we're proposing, which will be payable on the total funding raised through the DPS. And there may be additional support fee negotiated on a project by project basis, which will depend very much on the level of support that's required, the size and complexity of the project, and affordability. It's important to say that no fees will be payable until funding is raised, and the fees will be paid by the successful funder, but the funders will be told during the bid competition stage what the fees are, so that they can build them into their tender process. So this is a similar arrangement that happens under other DPSs, where successful suppliers pay a pre-agreed fee on successful funding. Aaliyah, I don't know if you want to pick up on this one. Okay, I'm not sure if Aaliyah's there. So I will. I've mentioned two-stage process. We're looking to launch the supplier onboarding before Christmas, and then stage 2, which will be the customer launch for contracting authorities, as early in the new year as possible, so that the DPS is fully up and running and live in January, February 2021. It will run initially until March 2023, but BEIS will have options to extend it for further periods into mid to late 20s. I'm hoping we've got Aaliyah online now.
I am. Thank you, Richard. Apologies, I had a camera but no voice. So just to follow on from where Richard left on, I'm Aaliyah Campbell, the commercial lead for the Heat Network Investment Project and Clean Heat Directorate at BEIS. So on these slides, I'm just going to take you through the process from a procurement point of view, and particularly highlighting some of the key benefits of using a dynamic purchasing system, and why this is a strong alternative and innovative procurement vehicle, particularly in the context of heat network investment. So as Richard has mentioned, the DPS will be launched in 2 phases, which accords with the need to have a supply base available before opportunities from public sector bodies can be advertised on the BHIVE DPS. BEIS will publish as the administering authority the DPS ITT on the OG platform /TED and Contracts Finder. This will provide suppliers an initial 30-day response window, e.g. to raise any clarifications on the documents they see with the notice, and also an opportunity to do early onboarding. As Richard had mentioned, in order for suppliers to apply to join the DPS, they will need to complete a selection questionnaire, and in accordance with PCR, should be admitted if successful within 10 working days. Obviously, the key flexibility in the DPS is that throughout the life of the DPS, suppliers and funders can join at any time following the above process. Customer onboarding will come a year once the minimum threshold of suppliers across both lots has been satisfied, and in order to facilitate successful competitions, as Richard noted, the DPS will allow for pre-market engagement between public sector bodies and suppliers. And I think this is quite a key stage and opportunity in the DPS process to make sure that the competitions are fit for purpose and there is an opportunity to engage beforehand. Next slide, please. There we go. So the relationships on the DPS and agreements which we've developed are in place to allow a degree of flexibility, which recognises the diversity in heat network, allowing these agreements to comply with the restricted procedure that is established via a DPS, and also provide a degree of standardisation, which we, through market of engagement, have identified as desirable. BEIS, as the administering authority and sponsor for the BHIVE, will be the party to the DPS agreements with successfully onboarded suppliers. TP, in the context of the whole consortia, will operate and support the successful running of the DPS as BEIS's agent and as the HNIP delivery partner. Suppliers who are successful in competitions on either lot will enter into call-off agreements with customers with the model project development and shareholder agreements and asset finance term sheets, which Richard mentioned earlier, and this again is to facilitate common models for heat network investment and relationships between public and private sector. Next slide, please. So in closing, this slide sets out some of the key benefits and advantages of using DPSs as an alternative procurement vehicle. And I think it's quite key to highlight the value for money offering here in terms of suppliers and customers joining a DPS. In terms of the upfront time and costs to join a DPS, these are significantly reduced and customers can ensure tailored costings for their specific projects. The speed, as alluded to in terms of onboarding suppliers, really allows for an improved process which doesn't require long bid periods and uncertainty in terms of will you have the opportunity as a supplier or funder to access customer opportunities. Compliance, DPSs are fully compliant PCR vehicles and obviously do form a form of restricted procedure. But more importantly, the flexibility and market accessibility on the DPS is a key distinction and reason for us choosing this as our preferred method in order to get heat network investment off the ground. I think the value add for allowing suppliers to join at any time really allows both customers and suppliers to enjoy and recognise what changes are happening in the market and specifically respond to those. Finally, CCS have been a close partner with Triple Point and BEIS in the development of the BHIVE and have provided on-the-shoulder support and design assurance. BEIS and CCS actually delivered the first energy DPS in Helga, and in delivering the BHIVE DPS, we're hoping that we'll continue to strengthen this relationship and ensure that there are opportunities on the market for flexible procurement for energy and heat network assets. That's all from me. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you both very much. We have about 5 minutes left of the session today. So are there any questions still outstanding for our speakers? I think most of the ones that have been sent through already have been answered. Feel free to raise your hand if you have a question, particularly in regards to the funding framework, as we've not had any through on that in particular. So I think there's a hand raised. William?
Yes, it's a simple question. I was just wondering whether what is going on for the EU ETS and how combined heat and power is going to be assessed for emissions trading, because when I was working with the Joint Research Centre in Petton, we identified the fact that the EU Marcal model was actually cross-subsidising the electricity from the heat using the boiler counterfactual method, which Ed Davey endorsed. Now that is extraordinary because the marginal cost and the marginal emissions, you know, from a peak load engine-based CHP are zero, whereas the boiler counterfactual method treats the heat as no different as heat from a gas boiler, and it distorts the whole of the modelling. And
William,
I'm just
we'll see if we can answer that. I'm not sure.
has EU ETS been changed to reflect the correct method for analysing CHP?
I can maybe, perhaps I'm the best one to respond to this, if that's all right, Sam.
Yep, go ahead, Caroline.
I think the important thing to say is that, firstly, the UK will formally leave the EU ETS in 6 weeks' time. I think from my side of things, my real worry, I have to admit, is that we still have no clarity from government on what will happen from the 1st of January. There are two options currently. Either we have a UK ETS, which is likely to almost in its entirety, including the way in which CHP is treated, transpose the EU ETS but into a standalone UK ETS scheme. My personal view is that that's unlikely at this point. The alternative option is that Treasury introduces a carbon tax from the 1st of January, which will be different. And if I'm totally honest, we have some concerns with that, how it will operate, particularly regarding trading, that I think we do really need to work on. So I think, I guess what I would say is, wherever EU ETS goes, I think the key focus for industry right now is getting clarity as soon as possible on what is about to happen from the 1st of January.
Thank you very much.
Are there any further questions? No, if not, then thank you so much for joining us this morning. I hope you found the presentations interesting, and thank you to our speakers for all the time they put into preparing them. We really appreciate your feedback on today's session, and also on the market in general. So I look forward to hearing from you, and hopefully we can host this event in a less virtual environment next year. Thank you very much.